Well, good evening. Hope everybody's having a good Wednesday evening. I know that this is different from our usual Wednesday night, but in time we'll get back to Wednesday evenings normal again one day. Just an announcement before we get going. I was asked to do this at this time. That way those that are watching online at home and those of you that are here will have all the information. There'll be information about this in the bulletin as well, so look for that Sunday. And when that gets emailed out as well, but we have been through, I won't mention the person that did this until I'm told who that we can, but an individual has purchased a subscription of Polishing the Pulpit 365 for the entire congregation to enjoy. So I've been asked to mention that tonight and how you can get that. Look in the bulletin this week. It'll be in your email tomorrow. But it'll also be in the print bulletin as well for Sunday, and we'll try to make sure we have a rotating announcement as well. But you can follow a specific link that you'll find in the bulletin. We'll also make sure we email this out to everyone that has it, and you can follow it. It'll initially take you to this website. You just scroll down until you see step 1. There's a little blue URL that you need to click. You click that. It's going to take you to this page, and you click Sign Up. Now, this is not going to cost you any money. But what you're going to get access to is a large number of the Polishing the Pulpit videos, as well as all of the 2020 videos, which are being made online only, since Polishing the Pulpit was effectively canceled for this year due to the coronavirus. So click that sign up button, and what you'll need to do is you'll need to follow the prompt that picks up. It's the bottom one. You'll be signing up as a member of a congregation, and once you click that bottom button, just go to the next. It's going to take you through this. Just keep clicking through it, and you will just type in East Hill Church of Christ. You'll follow that out as you continue. You'll create a username for yourself, and once you get through that process, they will email you and tell you that you've been signed up, that you've been registered, and once you do that, you'll be able to get to all of the videos that come on the PTP 365 subscription, and you'll have access to that for 1 calendar year starting from today. So look for that information in the bulletin, and if you need any help, I know we went through that really fast, but if you need any help, just let the office know. We'll help you as much as we can, and we'll get you set up with that. So that is free. It won't cost you a dime. Now, if it tries to charge you, you're in the wrong place. So don't pay him anything. It's already been paid for. And once you get signed up and everything gets approved, you'll get that email of how to take care of the rest. So if you have internet, you can access that. And also, if you don't have internet, we will find a way for you to be able to come to this building and access this as well. So whatever you need to do to access this information, this will give you a large amount of videos and things that will aid you and your family studying right now. I know a lot of things are different right now, but this is just a tool that you can use to better your household and to deepen your study. So I appreciate someone purchasing that for us, all of us here. So everyone here at East Hill can get it. Unfortunately, if you're not associated with East Hill, according to the rules set up by PTP 365, can't really do that. But will you just keep up with that, and that'll help you at East Hill with your studies. We are in Daniel chapter 8, so go ahead and be turning to Daniel chapter 8. We finished Daniel chapter 7 last week, and I'm going to say this as we said last week. Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 8. Not the most exciting chapters, okay? Last week, interesting chapter. Not the most exciting. Probably you've never heard a sermon on Daniel chapter 7. And just to help you out, not going to. Daniel chapter 8, probably never heard a sermon on Daniel chapter 8. Not going to. There's not a huge amount of information here, but you and I will learn as this chapter ends, just as chapter 7, in the reign of Belshazzar. We've left Nebuchadnezzar. We're in the reign of Belshazzar now, as you see in the beginning of chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 5 that we will move to next week. Remember, we're going in chronological order. I know that hurts your brain. I promise you, it hurts me just as much to figure out that we're on class 7 in chapter 8. We'll be in class 8 on chapter 5. I'm struggling right there with you, but we're in Daniel 8 tonight. Next week, we're in Daniel chapter 5. Now, notice Daniel chapter 7 and 8 begins with Belshazzar. You go back to Daniel chapter 5, and you read this: Belshazzar the king made a great feast. And you end that chapter in Daniel chapter 5, verse 30 and 31, where the end of the reign of Belshazzar takes place. So Daniel chapter 8 is right in the middle of the reign of Belshazzar, which brings us directly, when we finish tonight's class, to the middle of our study inside of the book of Daniel. But Daniel chapter 8 is all about a future rise. Remember, that's what Daniel chapter 7 was about, these future nations that rise and fall. Now, let me say this. This will make much more sense after next Wednesday. But when we see the end of the reign of Belshazzar, we will recognize that he had forgotten everything his father Nebuchadnezzar went through. Someone's actually going to remind him in Daniel chapter 5, did you forget about Daniel? See, Belshazzar is going to see this writing on the wall, and his great sorcerers, his great interpreters could not interpret what it meant. And one lady is going to say, do you remember Daniel? So Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8, if kept in mind with Daniel chapter 5, is a reminder to Belshazzar, you didn't get here on your own. Neither did this nation of which you are rising above, and the nation that's going to come after you, because in Daniel chapter 5, the ending of that chapter, this nation is divided into two areas, the Medes and the Persians there in Daniel chapter 5. But tonight we're in a future rise, and we'll be talking about Daniel, and we'll be talking about this particular grouping. Now, in Daniel chapter 8, there are 5 different areas that we're going to look at, all in your handout. Remember, you can get these online as well. Click on information. I believe it says class handout, and you can get to those on your phone as well. And then we still have some up here. But Daniel chapter 8, 5 different areas we're going to look at. We'll get the introduction, which is verses 1 and 2, which is the setting of this chapter. Then we're going to talk about Cyrus the Great, Alexander the Great. We're going to see a continuation of some of these things that takes place here in Daniel chapter 8. And we're going to end in a troubling event. But what I want you to do to open up Daniel chapter 8 is I want you to go to the very last verse of Daniel chapter 8. It's verse 27. Go to Daniel 8:27. And I want to give you a preface about tonight's class. You ready for this? I don't know all the answers. Matter of fact, we're going to understand a few of the things that we're reading, but listen to Daniel 8:27. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterwards I arose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. All right. Daniel says it was so wild that he fainted. He was sick for a few days, and after that he just got back to work. So listen, tonight here's what we're going to do in class. We're just going to have to faint for the next 40 minutes. And then after that, next week, we're going to get in Daniel chapter 5, and we will be just fine. But endure with me tonight in Daniel chapter 8, because Daniel says it was so difficult to understand, and no one else understood it, that he just goes back to work. But here's what happens in the book. It's the same thing in Daniel chapter 7. God is in control of the rise and fall of nations. Now, Daniel chapter 8 specifically, this is predictive prophecy. God is going to say, here is what's going to happen. Same thing as we read in Daniel chapter 7. And those things later on in history are going to take place. You can study the rise and fall of nations, and you can see these things take place. So in Daniel chapter 8, begin with me with the introduction. This is the setting of Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. Read it with me. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. That was Daniel chapter 7. This is Daniel chapter 8, a second vision. Verse 2, I saw in vision, and it came to pass when I saw it was at Shushan in the palace, was in the province of Elam, I saw a vision, and I was by the river Eulalia. So here's Daniel, and here's what we learn. He is in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. Now, this is going to be very closely related to Daniel chapter 5, because many historians will say the reign of Belshazzar took place from 3 to 5 to 6 years. So either A, Daniel is in the middle of the reign of Belshazzar, or he is at the right tail end of the reign of Belshazzar. Now remember that next week, because midway through the chapter of chapter 5, someone's going to say, don't you remember what Daniel did for your father? And that's going to make a lot of sense, because Belshazzar forgot who Daniel was, and Belshazzar number 2 forgot who God was. And by the way, who controls the rise and fall of nations? It's God. So what has Belshazzar done? I believe he only reigned for 3 years. In his short 3 years, he forgot who God was. All this is going to be reiterated in chapter 5. But here we are in the introduction. We're now in the reign of Belshazzar. We are in year number 3. So we move from the introduction and we go over to the area of which I've entitled Cyrus the Great, which is going to take us to the next 2 verses, verses 3 and verse 4. Let's see what it's described here. Then I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before a river, or the river, a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but the one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. All right, here's what you need to know about Daniel chapter 8 as we start these visions, as Daniel's seeing them. He's beside the river. That's where he said he was in the vision. And beside this river, he saw, behold there, a ram. And that ram had 2 different horns on it, and one is going to exceed all of the others. Now, I would suggest to you that this ram is going to be talking about a later nation that's going to come, and this specific horn is going to be talking about one of the leaders that's going to rise above all the rest. Now, many historians say that this is Cyrus the Great. Now, look at verse 4, because let's see the strength of this man. He says, I saw the ram. It was pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his own will and became great. All right, think about the rise and fall of nations. What took place in the rise and fall of nations? What was their end goal? What was every nation trying to do? By the way, it's what most nations are still trying to do today. We don't use these terms very often, but what were the nations trying to do? Conquer the world. It's all about world domination. Now, whether you recognize this or not, but our world is still struggling for power, isn't it? Right now, we live in the country that's seen as the superpower of the world. That's not always been so, by the way. Has it? Throughout the history of time, has the United States always been the number 1 power? Okay, now here's a strange question to your ears. Will we always be? Hope we are, don't we? But if we look at history, what has happened to all nations? They rise. What's next? Then they fall. Now here's what happens. Look at Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to look next week in Daniel chapter 5 at Belshazzar. What happens when a nation is rising? What happens before they fall? Who do they forget and who do they walk away from? God. Really, if we define the book of Daniel outside of the life of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel himself, with the events that took place with him specifically, the rest of the book is about how nations rise, powers come to be, God is forgotten, and then they fall. Well, that's a message for us, isn't it? By the way, I believe that message can talk about nations. I think that's obvious in the book of Daniel. I think that book specifically, or that message, can talk about communities. Have you not seen communities get to peaks and then fall? I think that message can also talk about maybe families. Have you ever seen families that at one time were great and large, but now you look and they're very small? By the way, I think there's great application to this. But can that refer to congregations of God's people? They exceed themselves, and what happens? They try to stand on their own, and then they decline. See, we don't use the word fall when it comes to churches, but they decline. Just think about this. In your home is God number 1. That's going to be Belshazzar's problem. In this nation, see, the home should always be first. I'm talking about a nation. In the congregation, it's East Hill. Is God number 1? You have to answer that. In our nation, is God number 1? I'm a little concerned about that one, aren't you? Number 3. In the United States of America, is God the priority? I don't think so either. Does that mean we give up? What about the people? What about Daniel? Daniel's already survived the rise and fall of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel had to say to Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to be like a wild animal, and for a period of time you're going to eat the grass and be as a wild beast. Daniel's now under the reign of Belshazzar, and this dream is so great, verse 27, that he fainted for a period of days, and then he just went back to work because nobody understood it. Did Daniel just give up? No. Even though Daniel was seeing these things, they were prophetic visions coming from God, predictive prophecy, Daniel continued on. Now, when you move from verse 4, you move into verse 5. We go from Cyrus the Great, then later on to Alexander the Great inside of verse 5. This is a different image that he sees. Now, look at just the first phrase of verse 5. This is very interesting to me. And as I was considering, now think about this. Daniel's having this vision. He's beside this river. He describes it to us in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. He sees this he-goat. And now as he sees this other vision, the ram, and now in verse 5, as he was thinking about it, here comes the next wave. Now you and I are lucky because we get to read verse 4 and verse 3, and we can press the pause button. As he was considering these things, look at what happened. This is verse 5. And as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Here's another wild vision that's coming. But think about this. Daniel was still considering the ram that he had just seen by the river that came from every other direction. Now something is coming from another direction. I also find it interesting that this one, verse 5, is coming from westward, but verse 4, that ram came from the west, the north, and the south. This next one, verse 5, comes from the west, and it's almost as if he comes from every area of the earth. Seems as if he's bigger. He's described as a he-goat. Let's see his power, verse 6. Came to pass, the ram had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. It describes him as being someone who has power and being someone who has fury. What does the word fury usually bring to mind? Is that positive? There we go, swift destruction. That's the concept here. Swift and massive. Now just imagine this. Now, I know that you've not had a vision before. You know why I know you haven't had a vision before? You know how I know that? I'm not saying you had never had a dream. But there's not a person in this room that's had a vision from God. You know how I know that? That's right. Those things have ceased. That was a part of the New Testament. Read that about the gifts of the Holy Spirit and other things that God did, because that which was perfect was come, and that which was left for us from Him is here. That's right. That's right. His power, His fury, His world domination. Do you get the idea? The rise and fall of nations. The rise and fall of nations. And here's the point. Daniel's in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. And what has he done? He has forgotten about the God that took care of his father. We're going to read that in Daniel chapter 5. So you're going to have to hold Daniel chapter 8 to Daniel chapter 5 next week. But here is Alexander the Great, and he's going to do all these things, and all these things are going to happen, and he's going to have anger. This is verse 7. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with an anger against him, and he smote the ram and brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. How about that? World domination. Go do some history and studying on Cyrus the Great and Alexander the Great, and you will see that it was their goal, it was their work to destroy and conquer the world. By the way, what was Nebuchadnezzar trying to do? He's trying to conquer the world, wasn't he? Now, I don't really know, and you don't really know what Belshazzar was trying to do. If you go to Daniel chapter 5, we'll do this next week as we start. We see Belshazzar more as one who was more interested in the party scene. I believe that's why his kingdom, number 1, only lasted just a very few years. He was not interested in his kingdom. He loved being king, but he seemed to have other things to do. Didn't really see him conquering the world like these others, but this is that vision. Just remember verse 5. He was considering, and this happened, and it just keeps happening. Down to verse 8, we see the future. Therefore, the he-goat waxed very great. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven. I believe verse 8 talks about the future, these kingdoms that are going to come out of these other kingdoms, and the whole world is going to feel what they were enduring. I don't know about you, but I don't want to have this vision. I know it's kind of dry for us. Not a lot exciting going on right now, is there? But think about what you're discussing. God is saying into the future to Daniel in a vision that there's going to be this rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall of nations. Who's in control? That's the message we have to take from this. By the way, this is the same message, and this is why I believe chapter 7 and chapter 8 exist in the reign of Belshazzar, because Belshazzar is going to forget who God is. What happens when we forget who God is? You know, we're all here tonight studying. We're all here immersed in Daniel chapter 8. At least we should be. It's what we're here for, isn't it? What are you taking away from Daniel chapter 8? God is in control of the rise and fall of nations. I know that's redundant, but have you ever had to be told something twice? I believe Daniel chapter 7 was the first time Belshazzar was told through this vision of Daniel. I believe Daniel chapter 8 is the second time where this indication is given that God is in control. Now, this is happening both in Daniel chapter 7 and in Daniel chapter 8 in the visions of who? I know they're God's visions, but what head are they in? Daniel. So God is telling Daniel what? I'm in control. Now, when we miss this point right here, we're not going to say it any other time but here. When Daniel forgets who is in control, Daniel will no longer turn to God. Who was this vision given to? It's given to Daniel. This vision was not given to Belshazzar. This vision was not given to Nebuchadnezzar. This vision was not given to the kings that are going to come in the future. And it was given to Daniel because Daniel needed to know that God was in control. That's why Daniel chapter 8 is important to us. That's why as we are studying Daniel chapter 8 right now, we know that God is still in control. I don't know, ladies and gentlemen, how long the United States of America is going to reign. I don't have that information, do you? Daniel was not given specific information on when this was going to take place either. He was told there's going to be a change. That's what he's learning. It's a double-fold change in Daniel chapter 8. It's going to come in Daniel chapter 5. We'll see that next week. But these great futures are taking place. And Daniel's seeing all of this. What would you do if that was the vision that you were given by God? Your nation's getting ready to crumble. How positive is that? Well, take this for a fact. It keeps going, because then you have the continuation that takes place as we roll into verse 9. We're going to see this little horn again. And out of one horn came forth a little horn, which waxed exceedingly great, toward the south, toward the east, toward the pleasant land. All right, what were these nations trying to conquer? Well, all the good things of this world. If they had all the good things of this world, why would they try to conquer the bad things of this world? They're going after the pleasant lands. They're going after all of these things. And this continuation continues to go. And this one that's being described, matter of fact, this is characteristic of both of them, Alexander the Great and Cyrus the Great. They both had egos. Verse 10, it waxed great. They waxed great. Even to the host of heaven, and came down some of the host of heaven and the stars of the ground and stamped upon them. What would it be like to square off against God? Anybody would like to fight God tonight? You already lost. You started lost. But there's these egos of these nations that nothing is going to destroy them. By the way, just look at history. Any nation that's ever been destroyed, whether internally or externally, did they think it was going to happen? No, that wasn't in their plan, was it? Nebuchadnezzar's plan to rule the world, did he ever think, by the way, were Nebuchadnezzar's visions about the end of his kingdom? You remember the image he saw and the kingdom's going to come, the church in Daniel chapter 2? What was that really about when Nebuchadnezzar was told, your kingdom's coming to an end? But did Nebuchadnezzar plan for his kingdom to ever come to an end? Has the United States ever planned for the day that it's not longer here? Any other nation you want to pick, do they ever plan for the time when they're not going to be there? I would suggest to you that maybe sometimes our egos get in the way. By the way, there's going to be a level to this. This is verse 11. We have this prince of the host that takes place here. Yea, in this particular scene in Daniel chapter 8. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Go ahead and go into verse 12. And a host was given against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. There's this level, there's this sacrifice that's taking place. I'll go ahead and tell you, verses 11 and 12, there are a lot of people that have written a lot of things about verse 11 and 12. You know how I'm going to leave verse 11 and 12? Just go read verse 11 and 12. I'd love to give you an exact, here's what that means, here's what that means. I looked at about 14 different writers, and not one of them had the same thing on verse 11 and 12. Remember verse 27? Daniel fainted, he was sick for days, and none understood it. What's happening? These great powers of the world, whether this is talking about them fighting among themselves, whether this is talking about them fighting amongst the world, or whether this is talking about them fighting amongst God, none of them will prevail. Because who is in control of the rise and fall of nations? God is. God is. God always is. One is speaking, by the way, this is verse 13. Then I heard a saint speaking, and another saint said unto the certain one which spake, how long shall the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation to give both sanctuary and the host trodden underfoot? Go ahead and read verse 14. He said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. By the way, just as much as verse 11 and 12, verses 13 and 14, same 14 writers didn't get that equal as well. Remember, Daniel had this vision. He fainted. He didn't know what it was. He was sick for days. Then he went back to work. What's it about? Who's in control? Daniel chapter 8. God is. Now let me ask you this question. Because verse 14 is a stopping point for us. Because once we hit verse 15, we've really got to get going. But right now, I'm talking about this very moment, as each second becomes anew. By the way, have you ever thought about this? Every time the clock clicks to the next second, that second is new. It's not the one we just had. It's not the one we had yesterday. It's a new one. As time marches forward in newness, who's in control now? What about now? And now? The same God that was in control in Daniel chapter 8, the same God that was in control in Daniel chapter 1, and the same God that will be still in control when we finish the book of Daniel is still in control when we started this analogy of the seconds that are new. And by the way, if this world stands for 1,000 more years, who's going to be in control? 10,000 more years, who's going to be in control? Same God. By the way, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, who was in control? The same one. Now that tells you and I at least three different things in my mind at this stopping point of this chapter. If God was in control then, in the beginning, if God was in control in Daniel chapter 8, what makes us think God can't handle 2020? Tough year. Who's in control? Same one is in control. By the way, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went to the fiery furnace, who was in control? Later on in the book of Daniel, as we'll study, when Daniel goes to the lion's den, who is in control? The same God. Number two, it makes us ask this question, or it makes us see this statement. If we question whether God is in control right now, what does that say about our image in our minds of God? It makes our image of God weak, doesn't it? If God cannot handle 2020, then how in the world did he handle Daniel chapter 8? How in the world did he handle Daniel chapter 7? We get Daniel chapter 5. How in the world is he going to handle that? It's coming next, by the way. Time is going to be marching anew in the book of Daniel. We're going to read about it, but for them, they lived it. How did God handle that? Sometimes our view of God is very weak. Oh, I agree wholeheartedly with you. Let me ask you a question. When someone dies, did God make that happen? What made that happen? What brought death in this world? Sin, okay? When tragedy takes place, did God make that happen? What usually brings I know sometimes tragedies are freak occurrences. But usually what happens when a tragedy takes place? What brought that into this world? Sin. Do you see the common enemy that we face alongside God? Is God fighting the devil?
God set the world in motion.
That's right.
Just like he made our bodies, which are miraculous in how they're made.
That's right.
He made the earth to go, tornadoes and
That's right.
fires and everything. He made all that. And that's not to say if you pray for safety or something that he won't.
That's right.
Things, but he's not going to say, okay, Jonathan, tomorrow you get lightning, and Joe tomorrow.
That's right.
Thunder, and he's just not going to do that. He lets the motions that he has set when he.
That's right, when he set it forth. That's right. I agree. But in these rise and fall of nations, who's in control? By the way, we have a reaction to God being in control. Do you not have a reaction to God being in control? God offers salvation. Do you have to accept it? God's not going to make you accept that. When we sin as Christians and we know we must repent, is God going to make you do that? Before you became a Christian, did God make you become a Christian? That's right. He's offered this world to us. By the way, in the very beginning, God put man in a perfect environment. Gave him one law. What'd they do? Broke it. God didn't make them do that. Some have written about Daniel. This is Daniel chapter 14. Some have written about this being a specific time. Some have referenced it being events in the future. In the book of Daniel, you have some things that are literal, some things that are figurative.
Some people considered at that time morning to night
As a day, that's right. So we may look at it and see 2,300 days, but it could be half that number. In the time frame. I'll go ahead and tell you. I'd love to tell you what Daniel chapter 8, verse 11, 12, 13, and 14 mean exactly. Me too. And they all different. Here's what I know. Daniel chapter 8, verse 27. Daniel had this vision, and he fainted during the vision. He was sick for days, and then he went back to work because none understood it. I wish I could stand before you and say, I got it. But if Daniel didn't get it, how do I have a chance to get it? I wouldn't, do I? So here's these troubling events. This is where we've got to kind of move forward. It came to pass, this is verse 15, when even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought the many, behold, there stood before me as the appearance of man. So here's Daniel. There's this vision. There's this meaning that's coming true. Verse 16, I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ui, and I called out and said, Gabriel, make this, which called out and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. I don't know who called out and told him to make Daniel understand this vision. Here's what I know, Daniel chapter 8, verse 16. One calls out, tells another named Gabriel. Many times people reference this as Gabriel, an angel. I see no reason why you could not do that or why you don't have to do that. But here's what happens. In this vision, someone calls out and says, make this man understand it. So this is what happens. Verse 17, there was fear, so he came near. That's right, first time as we read about him here. I believe it's the same Gabriel that's mentioned in other places. I believe it was Gabriel the angel. So there's this fear that Daniel has, and he comes near and stood. And Daniel says, I was afraid, and I fell upon my face. Now listen to this. But he said unto me, this is verse 17, last part, understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. What's that mean? I'm going to help you out. I don't know either. Here's what I know. Whatever was taking place, I know it involves the rise and fall of nations. The specifics, I'll go ahead and tell you, I don't know. But here's what I know. In all of this, Daniel was left with this great fear. Fear came upon me. He was afraid. And because of his fear, what did he do? Fell to his face.
What's the difference between a dream and a vision? Dream, you're asleep. Vision, your imagination.
I'm glad you answered it. I think that's a pretty good answer. Let me think on it and I'll let you know.
One writer said that a dream was what came from man, like
Yeah.
dreams,
Yeah.
like Daniel did
Yeah.
earlier, and the vision was God.
God's good, yeah. That's a good explanation of it. That's a great explanation of it. But all this left Daniel with this fear that took place, which leaves us with a stance. Now, as he was speaking, verse 18, now he was speaking with me. I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. Daniel, in verse 17, his fear caused him to bow down, to fall down before this one, and it left him in this state. So inside of Daniel chapter 8, you have this vision where Daniel has, proverbially, verse 18, gone to sleep in the vision because of the circumstances that overwhelmed him in all that was taking place. Now, verses 19 down to verse 26, a lot of things are going to happen. Unfortunately for us, we have very little time. So what I want you to do with me is I want you to read with me verse 19 down to verse 26. We're going to read it all in one lot. Now, you're going to have to read this in your paper Bibles because there was so much going on, couldn't get it in the handout. But read with me verse 19. I'll try to keep my best up with us on the screen, and then we'll comment about the things that take place as we've got in our handout. Here's verse 19. And he said, Behold, I will make thee known what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. And the rough goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn is that between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. And the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. And his power shall be mighty, but not his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper, danger or dark things to prosper in his hand. And he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy man. And he shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. Verse 25. Verse 26, and the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. All right. What's that mean? Look at verse 26. This helps us. Really, when you pick up in verse 19, you start seeing these things. You see all these powers that are rising and falling. But here's what's happened, verse 26. These things that are going to take place are going to be for many days. That tells me the future generations that are coming. By the way, if you go back into this particular segment, you can follow out history here. You can look at Media and Persia in verse 20. You can look at Greece. Eventually, you will find yourself, if you follow history out long enough, you'll talk about Rome. By the way, look at verse with me. Verse 25, I'll back us up in our PowerPoint to verse 25. This one that's in control now, he's going to prosper, but who is he going to fight against, that last part? The prince of what? Who is that? Who is that? Certainly seems like it could be. Now listen, think about Daniel chapter 2. What kingdom was coming? The church, right? Would it be unreasonable to believe that the prince that's coming in Daniel chapter 8 was going to be Jesus? By the way, would Jesus ever have to go up against a nation later on in history? Did Jesus ever face the wrath of a nation? By what nation was he put to death? I know the Jews put him to death, but who was in power? Rome. Jesus ever going to fight mighty powers? Of course, he is. And whether that's talking about Jesus, whether it's not, here's what I know. This is verse 27. This is the key to the chapter. I know this is going to sound redundant. This is going to sound like a cop-out. But if Daniel didn't understand it, do you? Now, is there ever anything inside of Scripture that's hard to understand? Okay, who wants to teach a class in the book of Revelation? You sure? Why not? Nobody has a problem teaching on the book of Ephesians or Colossians or even the book of Acts, maybe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Pretty easy there, huh? Are there ever things that are hard to understand? There are, aren't there? Is Daniel chapter 8 hard to understand? First one to tell you, I don't get it all. I don't understand it all. I know that commentators write multiple different things, but here's what I know. It's the key. Daniel, after all of this takes place, and I, Daniel, fainted. It was so overwhelming. It was so disastrous to the mind of Daniel. Just imagine what Daniel's been through so far. Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 2. Daniel enters in the scene in Daniel chapter 1 with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he goes up against the kingdom where Nebuchadnezzar was king. And he was proved true, and so was God. You follow out Daniel chapter 1 through 4. Daniel is called upon to do things that no one else could do with the help of who? With the help of God. Daniel's been through a lot. We're right now in verse 27 of Daniel chapter 8. We're the halfway point of the book. 5 more chapters to go. Daniel's already been through a lot. And there's still more coming. By the way, many would put Daniel at this point in time. Nebuchadnezzar reigned in some 40 years. Many would put Daniel in about his 70s, about midway through the book of Daniel, or in the totality of all the things taking place in the book. But here's what I know. Daniel fainted and he was sick certain days. How many days was it, Daniel 8:27? How many days was Daniel sick? Trick question. Certain days. Don't know? You don't either. That's a trick question. That's like how many wise men were in the New Testament when Jesus was born? How many do we usually say there are? 3. We usually say there are 3 because there were 3 what? But how many does the text say? Wise men. How many days was it? Verse 27. Certain days. And he didn't understand it. He got up. He did the king's business. He was astonished still at the vision, but none understood it. There are a lot of things that I don't understand. Daniel chapter 8 in its totality is one of those. We get some of the things, but here's what we know. There is a rise and fall of nations. Now get this. This will bring us to our period of invitation. This vision was given to who? To Daniel. And none understood it. This was not given to Nebuchadnezzar. This was not given to Belshazzar, even though it's the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, which is, in most instances, his last year of reign. We move to Daniel chapter 5 next week. It will be his last reign. By the end of that chapter, in that very same day, his life will be gone. But this was given to Daniel. Why was it given to Daniel? What did Daniel need to know about Daniel chapter 8? Here's what I know Daniel learned. He fainted. He was sick certain days. He went back to work, and even while he was at work, he was astonished at what he saw. But what he saw, whether we can put all of it in proper line, what he saw, based on the evidence of Daniel chapter 8, was the rise and fall of nations. There was Medo and Persia. There was Greece. There were all these other nations that were going to come. And by the way, eventually, as you think about the book of Daniel, you keep marching through history. You see these nations rise and fall, and you get to the point where you're reading in the time of Matthew chapter 1, which brings us to what individual in Matthew chapter 1? Who shows on the scenes in Matthew chapter 1 and 2? It's Christ. Now listen, you look at the Old Testament. You look at the New Testament. And what are they both pointing to? Christ. By the way, who's in control of the rise and fall of nations? I'm not saying who's in control of what nations do, the good or the evil. By the way, even our country has good, and even our country has what? Evil. But who's still in control today? It's the same God. And everything in the Old Testament and everything in the New Testament is pointing us to one central figure. That's Christ. No matter what happens to our future, no matter what happens to this nation, no matter what happens to this world, God is still in control. But God's not going to dictate your life. He's not going to demand. He's not going to fight you. He's pleaded with you. By the way, that's why he went to the cross, John 3:16, Hebrews 12:1 and 2, for you and I. But it's an open invitation, isn't it? It's an open invitation. And we have to choose. He's still in control. Who's in control of the church? It's Christ, it's God, isn't it? Talked about in Daniel chapter 2. Talked about in the New Testament. Both in the Old and New are still pointing to Christ. So here's my question for us tonight. It'll be threefold. One for all of us, and a question for the groups of people that are in the room. Number one, where is your life pointing tonight? Yours. Not talking about somebody else. I'm not talking about that person down the street. I'm not talking about that person that's not here. I'm not talking about the person that's not here or here. Where is your life and who is in control of it? Because if it's not God, you will be much like Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5. You may peak, but eventually you're going to fall. And let me tell you, when Christians fall, when we fall even before becoming a Christian, we fall into the pits of sin, don't we? Sin will keep you longer. Sin will take you farther than you want to go. And sin will cost you more than you can pay. You'll rise. You may rise, but you're going to fall. Now, old Belshazzar, we're studying in Daniel 7, 8, and 5, he's about to fall because God was not the rule of his life. He forgets God. So where is God to your life? So that brings us to our last two questions. If you're not a Christian tonight, why not make tonight the night that God rules your life? You can look at his word. Matter of fact, if you want to study the gospel, we'll do that tonight with you, privately, later, whatever you want to do. And let it be known from the Scriptures what one must do to be saved. You can hear His word and believe it. You can repent of your past sins. You can confess the name of Christ. And, well, I've got some great news. The baptistry is prepared for you. Maybe you're here tonight and you need to become a Christian. Well, tonight's your night. As I look over the audience, I see a large number of people who you've been Christians a good while. Well, maybe like Belshazzar, that's who we're talking about in Daniel 7, 8, and 5. Maybe like him, we lose our focus. Our father knew who God was. Matter of fact, really turned himself to God, Nebuchadnezzar. But we just in our ignorance or maybe in our decisions, we've forgotten him. Well, here's what Belshazzar could have done. He could, like his father, turn back to God. Now, he's going to choose not to. But you don't have to choose not to. We know sin is in this world, and we know we commit it. And if there is sin in our lives, let's take it away by taking it back to the Lord. He'll forgive us. That's what all of this is about forgiveness. He's made the sacrifice. He's paid the price. If we'll yet submit ourselves to Him, because no matter what, when this world is over, on the day of judgment, guess who's still in control? The same God of Daniel chapter 8. The same God of today. And as those seconds tick away, new every moment, He's still in control. Do you need to become a Christian tonight? You can. Do you need to make your life right? You can. Charles has picked out an invitation song for us. They've got it ready for the screen so you can see it. Let's think about our souls. Let's think about eternity. And tonight, let's not forget about God. If you need to respond, let's stand and sing.